Good morning, everybody. And I know this is the second day of the Rebuild conference coming out of the Brexit Institute here in Dublin City University. Our panel this morning is the third panel, and talking about, we're looking at what are the criteria and principles shaping NGEU. And we have three speakers: Torney, Edoardo, Celeste, and Petra. We only have an hour, so it's a short enough time. My name is Derek Hand, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences here in DCU, and it is my pleasure to chair this session. So because we're, short enough time, and as academics, we know that we can talk. That's our business. I will introduce Diarmuid, who is a colleague of mine here in DCU, who is going to talk about the green transition. Okay, Diarmuid.
Thanks very much, Derek. I have a few slides to share here, so I'll just get that up and running. Derek, can you confirm? Can you see that okay? Yeah, I see it comes up from Federico. So thanks very much, Derek, for the introduction, and to Federico for the invitation. I was reflecting before the others joined there that it's a mark of the strange times we're living in, that although Derek has been the Dean of my faculty for I think about a year at this stage, I only met him in person yesterday evening for the first time at the launch of our colleague Gary Murphy's new book. So as Derek said, I've been tasked with talking about the green transition, that element of the Union's values as they pertain to next generation EU. And what I want to do in the time that I have is, I guess, to set the context for the green transition, and to provide an overview, a reminder possibly, or not, depending on your familiarity with the green area, of the scale of transition required. And then I'll just walk very briefly through a kind of the evolution of EU climate and environmental policy, and arriving at a discussion of the European Green Deal and next generation EU. So to start off with, I just wanted to start off with a couple of slides on trying to emphasize the scale of the climate and biodiversity crises. Crisis, emergency, these terms are used from time to time. I was struck yesterday in his opening keynote that Minister Paschal Donoghue remarked on words to the effect that when the EU was called upon in the case of a crisis or emergency, that the EU was not found wanting in terms of its response to the pandemic. And yet, my sense, and the sense of many people working in the environmental field, is that there is an equally urgent, if perhaps not equally visible, crisis facing us, facing Europe and facing the world, in the form of the climate and biodiversity emergency. And yet we're still not seeing, we've made significant progress, but we're still not seeing the kind of governance, policy, and societal mobilization around climate and biodiversity that is warranted. And so we just have two diagrams to try and illustrate that point. The first is this chart taken from last year's emissions gap report from the UN Environment Programme. So this is a report every year that essentially tries to capture and communicate the divergence between what climate science is telling us we need to do in terms of reducing emissions and the trajectory that we're on. And so this is quite a complex diagram. I don't want you to dwell too much on the details, but basically you can see that this line here is what's called the current policy scenario. So that's kind of where we're headed according to what governments around the world are currently doing. And then these sharp downward lines are the trajectories to achieve different temperature goals as set out in the Paris Agreement from 2015. So 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees were the two numerical targets included in the Paris Agreement. And so the takeaway from this is that we are not only globally are we not on those trajectories, but we're not anywhere near them. The line is trending upwards rather than downwards. So that's on climate. And then an equally urgent, but often less visible challenge, less visible in policy terms, is the biodiversity crisis. So this is just one way of illustrating that the scale of biodiversity loss is extinctions from 1500, from the year 1500 onwards. And if you look closely, you can see that there's a very small shaded area at the bottom. That's the background rate of extinction that we would expect absent human impact. And so you can see that that for all of these categories of animals, that the trend is not just trending upwards, but trending upwards incredibly steeply, and from a point in the recent past, we can more or less trace these impacts back to the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, both on climate and biodiversity. So that's just to set the context. The other bit of context that I wanted to emphasize is that climate change is no longer a distant threat. So we saw last year flooding in Belgium and Germany illustrated these in these two pictures. You can see former Chancellor Angela Merkel, wildfires in California, wildfires in 2019-20 in Australia. Climate change is no longer a threat that is experienced either by people in far-off countries, for us in the rich developed world, or by future generations. It is here and now. And there is going to be a major UN climate science report due to be published next Monday on the impacts of climate change. So that's one to watch out for. And that'll lay out it's expected to lay out in stark detail the scale of the impacts facing us. And so all of this leads to this idea that we are in an emergency and that we need urgent responses. And coming back to what I said earlier, I think we have made significant strides in policy terms in the EU and at global level, but we're not yet at that point of really internalizing, really understanding what a sustainable green transition means. But having said that, I don't want to completely rubbish what has happened to EU climate and environmental policy. And I want to just provide a very brief historical overview of how I would characterize the development of EU climate and environmental policy, going back to the early days of climate policy in the 1990s, where the Union basically said we are a climate leader, but didn't really do a whole lot to back it up. So it was kind of declarations at the international level, but without solid underpinnings in terms of domestic policies and measures to reduce, to limit or reduce the EU's emissions. In the early 2000s, we saw the first steps towards the development of an EU policy response. The centerpiece of this was the EU ETS, the pilot phase of which started in 2005. The Union's activity in this area was spurred by US withdrawal from the Kyoto Protocol, so George W. Bush's decision to withdraw the US from the Kyoto Protocol. Then moving into the 2010s, what we saw was the first development of a comprehensive but sector-specific framework for responding to climate change. And that point about it, the sector specificity is important because it was very much focused on on energy, on electricity and renewable energy in particular, and energy efficiency and so forth. But I think what marks the current era of union policy making, apart from earlier periods, was this attempt at deeper integration of the green agenda across the spectrum of the union's activities. And that has taken the form of the European Green Deal, one of the flagship priorities of the current Commission, embodied in the Commission communication that was published in December 2019. And what's really striking, if you look at that communication and you look at the range of EU activities in the framework of the European Green Deal, is that it is moving climate, environment and sustainability outside of that sectoral focus from DG Climate, DG Environment, and trying to integrate the European Green Deal across across all sorts of different areas: agriculture, investment, trade, and so forth, and to equip the EU with the tools needed to deliver that transition. And so I think that is a kind of a critical juncture. That's an important departure from the previous attempts at developing climate and environmental policy in the EU. And that's where I think the Next Generation EU comes in. So the priorities for the European Green Deal are, the three headline priorities are: no net emissions of greenhouse gases, so reducing emissions effectively to zero by 2050, decoupling economic growth from resource use, and the third pillar, which interestingly is no person and no place left behind, so addressing that question of a just transition. And so in that context, Next Generation EU is has been developed as a key enabler of the transition, as a financing mechanism with focus on areas like renewable energy, sustainable transport and so forth, the requirement for at least 37% of recovery and resilience plans to be allocated to climate funding, and that just transition piece. So funding for the just transition fund to enable regions and sectors that will be heavily impacted from the transition away from fossil fuels and other polluting activities, to help them transition to more sustainable means. So I think this is one way in which we see that attempt to embed the European Green Deal or European Green Deal thinking across the range of the union's activities. But coming back to my opening remarks, I think there are still significant challenges. And I come back to the scale of the challenge. I don't think, it feels to me, as someone who's been working in this area for about 15 years now, that discussions across society and business and policy making have kind of got to the starting line. So there's an acknowledgement now of that something needs to be done, but I'm still not convinced that the scale of transition is understood. There's no historical precedent for the type of the depth of transformation. The EU's targets for 2030 are a 55% reduction in greenhouse gases relative to 1990 levels, and as I said earlier, that net zero target for 2050. The chart you see on the screen there is from the European Environment Agency. So these are projections for future emissions, historical emissions, and projections for future emissions. And you can see that the trend line going forward is not in line with either the Union's 2030 or 2050 targets. I think there are also challenges in terms of integration and funding. So really getting into the detail of how sectors like agriculture and transport can be made sustainable, that's still very much a work in progress. And of course, we know there are a diversity of preferences among member states. So I think the jury is still out in terms of the ability of the Commission in particular to drive forward the green agenda through Next Generation EU and through other avenues. I think that for Next Generation EU in particular, I would identify two challenges. So one is that I think the 37% target is very welcome for climate funding in the resilience and recovery funds. But I think there's still a risk of seeing this as a sectoral challenge. And so we allocate 37% for climate. And then, the other 63%, we do whatever our member states do whatever they want with it. And the challenge really is to make sure that that other 63% is also consistent with the European Green Deal, and not just that we see climate and sustainability as that sector, and the climate and sustainability agenda is ticked by that 37% earmarking. Also, just one remark on funding and CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I know my colleague Goran is going to talk about later. So this is presented in the NGEU as a revenue source for the union, but from an environmental perspective, that would be a failure of CBAM, because of course the ultimate objective of CBAM is to get other jurisdictions to increase their environmental standards. It's not from an environmental perspective. The purpose of CBAM isn't to raise revenues. It's to compel other jurisdictions to raise their environmental standards. But I think that will be a point of discussion that will come up in the next panel. And very quickly and finally, because I know I'm more or less out of time, I just want to finish on one opportunity I see for DCU and for the Rebuild Centre, which is around this green and digital transition, which is very much a part of the EU framing of contemporary EU policy. And this also kind of hands over to my colleague Edoardo, who will be speaking next. These are two strengths of DCU and of the Brexit Institute, and I think there will be opportunities for us to explore the interaction and intersection between these two policy areas. And in that context, I'm looking forward to hearing my colleague Edoardo's intervention coming up next. So with that, thanks very much for your attention, and I'll hand back to you, Derek.
Okay, thank you for that, Dermot. In terms of setting up the kind of, I suppose, the task for the EU in terms of transition. And thank you also for setting things up for our next speaker, Edoardo, who is also my colleague from DCU in the School of Law and Government. And today he'll be talking about the digital transition.
Thank you very much, Derek, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. And special thanks to the organizers of this conference, launching the Rebuild Center of Excellence. I'm really happy to be part of this project. And thanks also, Diarmuid, actually, for introducing and for stressing, the potential that DCU will offer probably in the future in this area. Just yesterday, we were actually discussing about potential synergies in the area between environmental transition and digital transition. And indeed, you may now be able to see my slides. I decided to title my presentation, The Digital Transition, a Twin Transition, because so far there was a sort of like a dichotomy probably, but was seen as a sort of like divergence between, on the one hand, the digital revolution, and on the other end, this other important chapter of recent European policy, which was the green transition. While now, especially in light of the recent investment in the recovery plan, I think that is very apparent that actually these two transitions, these two revolutions are going hands in hands and are going in pair, and indeed can be seen as two twin transitions that should be actually complement each other. So the purpose of my presentation is essentially to tackle three main questions, which I think are preliminary to our debate. So first of all, I would like to clarify what we mean with the term digital transition, what the EU strategy in this field is, and then going back to the topic of this panel, what the guiding principles and values of this EU strategy are. So yesterday, prominent colleagues, experts in the field of banking and finance and EU economic policy have already explained the significant impact of the recovery plan, the prominence of this plan in EU history. I'm not repeating them, and I'm not an economic expert myself, but I think that simply by looking at the budget that has been allocated in the multi-annual financial framework for 2021-2027, plus the budget allocated for the recovery plan and Next Generation EU, you can immediately see that for the single market, innovation and digital, we have more than 160 billion euro allocated. So it's a significant amount of money allocated to this field. I did a brief sort of like a search on the various websites of the European Commission and other European institutions, just to map from a terminological perspective the use of the term digital transition, which is indeed quite new. So just for clarification and for curiosity for the audience, the European Commission uses interchangeably the terms digital transition and digital transformation, while there are other institutions. Here I've reported a screenshot from the website of the European Council that refers to the term digital revolution. Well, regardless of these terminological differences, I think that it's clear the underlying idea that EU institutions aims to convey at the moment. And this is the idea of a change, an ongoing change, a transformation that is progressively occurring at the European level. We are not at the stage of a radical revolution. We have already significantly invested in the digital field. It's now time indeed to enhance our capabilities, our skills, the potential that the EU has in the digital field. And what are the objectives indeed of this digital transition? I think that it is key, and from this we can also understand better the link between the digital transition on the one hand and the green transition that my colleague Diarmuid presented in the previous presentation. So there are three pillars of the EU digital strategy. So the first one is to promote technology that works for people. I will stress this later also in terms of the values and principles that the EU Commission is promoting. There is this idea of a human-centric approach to technology. I've recently used in one of my papers the term digital humanism. So you probably remember in the Renaissance, this was this concept of putting the individual at the center of the universe. Sometimes we are going back to something similar in the digital field, in the sense that we are trying to put individuals at the center. Technologies, technological innovation cannot overtake the centrality of individuals and their fundamental rights. The second core objective is to promote a fair and competitive digital economy. This is not a surprise, of course. The EU has been a strong player over the past few decades in promoting and enhancing the functioning of the internal market in this field. And the third objective as well is not a surprise, but it's very crucial point, especially in the times that we are living. And I think that the current situation with the recent attack to Ukraine also makes this point even more apparent. There is a need for Europe actually to promote technology in order to foster an open, democratic, and sustainable society. So you can see that there are essentially a series of beneficiaries of these core objectives, of these core pillars. So first of all, European citizens, secondly, European businesses, and third, of course, there is the society at large, but I think that if one reads the documents that have been recently published by the European Commission, one can immediately understand that the core target is, of course, sustainability, the protection of our environment. And indeed, I think that if one looks also at the recent initiatives organized in this field, and here I go back to the subtitle of my presentation, there is no Green Deal without a digital transition. So digital transition is seen as a sort of like a proxy to achieve the green transition as well. There is one other core objective, excuse me, that is somehow on the background. Is not make it explicit by the EU Commission, but is actually to promote Europe as a global leader, as a standard setter in this field. And here in this slide, for example, I've included the front page of a book, of an edited book that I had the pleasure to edit with two of my DCU colleagues, Federico Fabrini and John Quinn. We worked actually 2 years ago on the role that the EU is playing as a standard setter in the data protection sector. And indeed, the title of this book was Data Protection Beyond Borders, to highlight the role that the EU is playing to promote their policies and their values beyond EU borders. But now we could say that with the digital transition, this objective has been extended to the whole digital field. The EU needs a strategy to achieve the digital transition. And this strategy is guided by a compass. This is the so-called digital compass. This is the terminology used by the EU Commission. And you can see that the cardinal points of this compass are promoting digital skills among the population, among public institutions, among businesses. Of course, in order to promote skills, we need to invest in digital infrastructures. And both skills and digital infrastructures are proxies then to promote a digitalization of businesses and the digitalization of public administration. And in relation to these, you will excuse me for the second sort of like promotional break in this presentation, because in relation to the digital skills, just yesterday, actually, we added a new Erasmus Mundus Master in Law, Data, and Artificial Intelligence that DCU is coordinating for the first year. We got a funding from the EU in excess of €5 million to launch this new master. And this new master will be listed in the digital skills portal of the EU as one of the activities and training activities that is currently offered and funded by the EU to achieve the objectives of the digital decade. But going back to the core of the presentation and to the last question that I would like to tackle, what are the values and principles that are guiding this digital transition? Well, only a month ago, the EU Commission published a draft declaration on digital rights and principles. So this is an extremely important achievement. It's not to be fair the first time that the EU Commission is publishing a similar document on online rights. And in this slide, you can see the front page of the Code of EU Online Rights, a sort of like a guidance document that the EU Commission published already in 2012. However, this new declaration is actually, I would consider it a milestone in the promotion of digital rights and principles, because it's the first time that the Commission is promising to adopt a solemn declaration together with other EU institutions to make in a very explicit way what the guiding rights fundamental rights and principles of the EU are to tackle the digital decade, which indeed are the years between 2020 and 2030. From a historical perspective, we could say that the Declaration on Digital Rights and Principles does not emerge as a sort of like constitutional Big Bang. There have been various initiatives, especially promoted by civil society in this sector, and we can count more than 200 of them. However, as I will stress at the end of my presentation, I think that the declaration, which will be solemnly adopted by the Commission, has a particular value because of the prominence of the institution that will solemnly adopt the declaration. Let's briefly look at the principles included in the declaration. They are articulated around 6 core values. The first one, as I stressed at the beginning of my presentation, is putting people at the center. So having this human-centric vision for the digital transition. Then, of course, from this derives a right to internet access, to digital inclusion. There are then 2 principles which are actually corollary of the principle of some of the values promoted by the right to data protection, which are freedom of choice and safety. So the digital environment should be safe from illegal and harmful content, should be safe also in the context of development of artificial intelligence technology. It should be an environment that should help citizens to access public services. And this is indeed why we see participation as the 4th core pillar. And then the 6th core pillar is indeed sustainability. We cannot have a Green Deal without the help of the digital transition. And just to conclude more with a legal note for those interested in legal aspects of this, the declaration will only have a political value. It will not have a legally binding value. There is no direct mechanism of enforcement of the declaration, despite the fact that the Commission actually proposed to adopt an annual report on the status of the digital transition that then might help mapping the progress in this sector. However, what I would like to stress, just to conclude, is that the declaration has a very hybrid tone, I could say. It's halfway between a solemn declaration of rights, so almost a constitutional text, and halfway between a policy document. So I see really the strength of the declaration in its important advocacy function that I hope will play to foster the conversation on digital constitutionalism. So translating constitutional rights to address the novel challenges of the digital revolution and to reiterate that the digital world is no longer a lawless place, but that existing fundamental rights are valid online as offline. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Edoardo, for that. And thank you for the little advertisement for our new masters. So that's always good. As a dean, I have to endorse that sentiment. Our next speaker is Petra from the Central University of Europe. And she is going to talk about the rule of law, conditionality, regulation.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and to Federico, the very kind invitation, and congratulations on putting together this amazing project. I'm very happy to talk about a very, very topical issue indeed. And I have a three-parted presentation in mind, first talking about a little bit about the background of the conditionality regulation and the general EU rule of law problem. So where does this whole document fit into? Then I will talk about the essence, the merits of the conditionality regulation, and about the most recent judgment, Court of Justice judgment on the same topic, and the potential invocation of the document in the near future. So I very much think that the double nature of the EU's rule of law problem was visible during the conditionality regulation. What do I mean by saying that there is a double nature of the EU's rule of law problem? It's the following. Some nation states, they suffer from a rule of law decline, lack of limitation of governmental powers and separation of powers in general. And at the same time, there is a risk of the crumbling of separation of powers at the EU level too, where institutions fail to play their part and adequately step up against rule of law violations in this multi-level constitutional arena. So while in the national setting a power grab can be traced, in the EU an opposite phenomenon can be seen, a failure to act even against constitutional authorization and obligation foreseen by the treaties. Now, EU institutions, they hide their inaction behind alleged constitutional concerns of vertical separation of powers. They try to legitimize their overcautious approach and lack of dissuasive response to rule of law violator governments with a very narrow understanding of supranational competences, a very narrow understanding of conferral of powers, and an alleged lack of legitimacy for interfering into domestic affairs. Now, sometimes even the principle of horizontal separation of powers is violated just in order to prevent EU institutions from promptly responding to rule of law decline in the member states. Now, all this could be traced during the drafting of the conditionality regulation. Instead of the original plans of a reverse qualified majority to block the Commission, in the revised version, a qualified majority in the Council must support the Commission's decision for the mechanism to go into effect. Also, the focus was shifted from the rule of law to the importance of the protection of the Union's financial interests in conjunction with the rule of law. So the conditionality regulation became more of an anti-corruption tool than a rule of law enforcement tool. Now, rule of law breaches, it means, will be sanctioned if they affect or seriously risk affecting the budget of the EU in a sufficiently direct way. Now, Hungary and Poland, the two most likely candidates to be affected by the new rules, threatened to block the approval of the EU's 7-year budget, the multi-annual financial framework, and also the next generation EU COVID-19 recovery fund, if the conditionality regulation was adopted in its original form. The next generation EU could have been recreated under enhanced cooperation, probably by going outside the domain of EU law, even if with great difficulties. But there was no way to circumvent the unanimity requirements for the multi-annual financial framework. So as a political compromise, the final text of the conditionality regulation was agreed to be accompanied by guidelines on the way the Commission should apply the regulation. So the European Council agreed to finalize these guidelines once an action of annulment initiated by Hungary and Poland, attempting to have the conditionality regulation annulled, was decided upon by the Court of Justice. Now, this again shows a total disregard on the part of the EU for the rule of law and subordinating its values to political compromises, pleasing those who destroy the EU rule of law at broad daylight. So the arguments underpinning this strong statement are the following. A regulation is binding and effective as it stands, irrespective of any further interpretative measures. The text of the regulation does not mention any guidelines whatsoever. Second, the European Council does not have any lawmaking powers. Therefore, the guidelines can only be interpreted as a step taken out of the virus. And third, the European Council anyway cannot give instructions to the Commission that would go beyond its mandate. Also, when it comes to the attempt to have the regulation declared void, a piece of EU law's enforcement is not independent on an action of annulment. In other words, the Court of Justice's judgment or procedure does not have any suspensory effect. So the European Parliament very clearly made this point when it emphasized that the Commission must abide by the law. This means that the conditionality regulation should have been enforced as of the 1st of January 2021, irrespective of any annulment actions. So things escalated to such an extent that ultimately the Parliament voted to take the Commission to the Court of Justice for a failure to act under the regulation. Now, what are still the pros of the document for the future? Now, leaving aside this complicated background, I think the regulation represents a significant addition to the EU's rule of law toolbox for many reasons. First, it expressly and comprehensively links, for the first time in EU history, implementation of the EU budget to compliance with the core principles of EU law. Second, it comprehensively codifies, for the first time in a legislative instrument, the meaning and scope of the rule of law in light of the treaties and in light of the Court of Justice's jurisprudence. Third, it clearly describes in a non-exhaustive manner situations indicative of breaches of the principles of the rule of law. The regulation covering both individual and systemic breaches, which can either amount to actions, general measures, or recurrent practices, or failures to act by public authorities. Now, fourth, it is of significant political, legal, and also practical importance to establish the legal relationship between the different instruments that the European institutions have available, particularly to assess whether and to what extent these instruments could be operationalized in parallel so as to ensure a more comprehensive enforcement of the rule of law and other EU values. And finally, it authorizes a comprehensive risk-based approach that facilitates EU intervention to safeguard the financial management of the EU even before disbursement of EU funds. Now, the judgment that was triggered or that was initiated by Poland and Hungary was rendered last week on the 16th. And there were a number of symbolic elements in the judgment that I would like to emphasize. The number of intervening parties, member states intervening on the side of the institutions, the Court of Justice deciding the case in an expedited procedure. It ordered the applicants to pay the fees of the institutions, which is very rare. And ultimately, the court dismissed the application in its entirety. I think it was clear for everyone right from the outset that this case cannot be won. It was only initiated in order to prolong the actual application of the regulation on the basis of a political and not legal compromise, saying that the institutions will wait for the Court of Justice's judgment, even though legally speaking, they shouldn't have done so. Now, still, even though this is not a groundbreaking judgment, so the court just stated the obvious, namely that there was a legal basis for passing this regulation and it should be used now. But still, from many perspectives, this is a groundbreaking judgment. So first of all, it just says that the legal basis for the regulation is solid. It respects the principle of conferral, does not interfere with Article 7 procedure, and the process the conditionality regulation lays down is sufficiently clear. Also, the court dismissed the allegations by Hungary and Poland that the rule of law cannot be defined with sufficient clarity. The court very much emphasized the link to solidarity and mutual trust. And at the same time, it underlined the link between the rule of law and the EU's financial interest. Now, this probably is the weakest point or the most controversial point of the whole judgment, because immediately the question arises, would the original formulation of the conditionality regulation, not strictly linking it to the financial interest of the EU, be ultra-virus in light of the court judgment? What the court currently says is that withholding of funds under the conditionality regulation cannot be used as a punishment for rule of law violations, but only as a means of keeping EU funds out of unsafe hands. But the question is still there in the air. Can we just impose financial sanctions for rule of law violations? The court doesn't answer that. So for the future, and I think I will wrap up here, the real question is whether and how the Commission will just start using the conditionality regulation. My main message is that it should have been triggered already more than a year ago. And now the Commission just shouldn't wait for the formulation of certain guidelines. It is not only unnecessary in my view, but I also believe that it would be a violation of the rule of law, actually, this time on the side of the European Union institutions, to allow to come up with these guidelines and a non-legislative and a EU institution that does not participate in EU lawmaking actually draft law and instruct the Commission on what to do and what not to do. Of course, being in Hungarian, I cannot but mention that the April 2022 elections are very near, and it seems that the Commission doesn't want to influence the elections in any way, so it's unlikely that the mechanism will be triggered beforehand. The real question for Hungarians, at least for the future, is, in case a government change happens, whether the new government attempting to restore the rule of law would be harmed or not with the triggering of the conditionality mechanism and the resulting consequences that they will have to endure for the sins they have inherited from the current government with regard to rule of law decline. And I stop here and very much thank for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Petra, and thank you to all of our three speakers this morning. We have a little time before the next session. Are there any questions or comments? If anybody wants to put it in chat or to ask any of our panelists any questions. Monica Onini. Monica?
Here I am. Here I am. Hello. First of all, let me thank you all because, as Federico knows, these webinars allow us to learn a lot just in a few hours, and that's very important. I have a question for Diarmuid and Edoardo, and maybe a suggestion for Federico, if I may. Diarmuid spoke about new opportunities of research for future research, thinking about the green transition, and Edoardo spoke about, so you said no Green Deal without digital transition. So given, let me say it in this way, the new era we entered in since yesterday, I think there, for us all, it's obvious there is an anti-Ukrainian war and a post-Ukrainian war. Has not the time come to change the approach to these twin policies, as you said? I mean, should not, and that's the suggestion maybe for Federico, scholars try to think about a new agenda in this way, not a climate agenda, not a digital transition agenda, but a different one. Let us say climate change and digital transition, and correct me if I am wrong, they should become, since yesterday, new tools, or let me steal Petra's words, should be two important elements in the toolbox of foreign policy, European foreign politics. Because I think that head of state and government understand better this sort of threats, war, simply. And therefore, if we succeed in rewriting an agenda where the head title is Foreign Affairs, the head title is Security and Defense, and the toolbox of this new agenda are, on the one hand, climate policies and digital transition, maybe this would somehow change the attitude of more than one member state, of more than several member states, also of Poland and Hungary, for example. So I am really thinking about this also because what Edoardo showed us, security and defense only 14.9 billion euros. In the new situation is really, I see the facial expression of Federico, is nothing, I think. And I'm thinking also about another point, or rather two other points. We do not yet know exactly what China's reaction will be. And Europe should think about this immediately, not after that China reacts. And we do not yet know how Syria will react. We have not the time to go to deepen these arguments, but by saying China, I mean China and Taiwan. And by saying Syria, I mean Syria, Golan, and Israel. So you know what I'm speaking about. Therefore, I think, should we not, as scholars, rethink a greater agenda with all these pillars in it? I hope I have been enough clear. So excuse my English, not so strong. Thank you, thank you.
Diarmuid, do you want to speak?
Sure, thank you, Monica, for that very relevant and provocative question. I think I agree in parts, and I possibly in parts have a slightly different perspective. So first of all, with respect to the climate agenda, there are precedents for this. So in the mid-2000s, 2006, Russia-Ukraine gas crisis was one of the prompts for the development of what became the 2020 climate and energy framework for the EU. So there has been, and it's been well documented that the Commission used that as a way of moving climate up the agenda, was to kind of hook the climate agenda onto a broader geopolitical agenda. It sounds to me like you're expressing an argument in favor of securitization of other areas of digital, of green transitions, and I think there are merits to that. There are also I think some risks to it. And there's been a long debate in environmental circles about the opportunities, but also the challenges of, or the risks of framing environmental challenges as a security threat. So I think it's a question that we need to, and maybe Federico will come in on this. This is obviously a rapidly evolving situation, and it is a defining moment, and it's something that I think a critical juncture that we will have to kind of reflect on and its implications for the Rebuild Centre and all of our individual research agendas. But thanks very much for bringing it up, Monica.
Okay, thank you, Diarmuid. Edoardo?
Yes, many thanks, Derek, and thank you, colleague Professor Bonini, for this very intriguing question. So I will pick two of the elements that actually you raised. So first of all, I would like to qualify the sort of like slogan that I've used in my presentation: no Green Deal without digital transition. It's a slogan in the sense that the situation is, of course, far more complex. And as you perfectly highlighted, it's far more complex, especially in light of the recent development in Ukraine. Why? Because, of course, the digital transition has some impacts on the green transition itself, in the sense that in order to support the digital transition, one needs, for example, electricity, one needs production of energy. Energetic sovereignty is an important point in order to allow, for example, supercomputing capacity in the EU, the relocation of servers in the EU, and so on. So when I when I use the slogan, no Green Deal without digital transition, this situation is reality is far more complex because, of course, there is the problem of energetic sovereignty of the EU, how to produce this energy and so on, and what is the impact of the digital transition on the green transition as well. So somehow this can be seen as a sort of like vicious circle if the two policies, the green one and the digital one, are not studied together as two complementary policies. So this is the first point that I wanted to make. Second point that I wanted to make in terms of like your sort of like point about like reshaping these policies under a different sort of like umbrella. So you mentioned, for example, defense and security. What I wanted to stress is that the digital transition, in contrast to the green transition, is not an objective per se. The digital transition aims to achieve a series of other fundamental rights, including, for example, the right to an healthy environment, but also, and this I think is quite apparent now in light of the publication of the draft declaration on EU digital rights and principles, we have, of course, democracy. We have, of course, the rule of law, as our colleague Petra also mentioned. So in this way, I can see, as you said, the digital transition as an instrument then to achieve objectives of the foreign policy of the EU. Digital transition, if we promote a European model based on the rule of law, democracy, and other freedom of expression and other important fundamental rights that constitute the DNA of European values, I can see the digital transition as an instrument to achieve these other objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Edoardo. Federico?
Thanks, Derek. I also wanted to follow up to this conversation. I want to go in the direction of common foreign security policy, as Monica was pushing us, because I think the real expert here is Ken McDonough, our colleague working on CFSP, and he's going to take over in a few minutes. But I suppose along a similar line, I also wanted to ask a bit perhaps of a provocative question to Diarmuid and Petra. I take the point that Edoardo was making right now, that the digital transition is more neutral as an objective. But if you think about the ambition of sort of achieving an environmental transition and the objectives of protecting the rule of law, can you not see there potentially a tension? And I'm thinking here more about Poland rather than Hungary, but clearly Poland is the EU member state that would need more money for the environmental transition compared to any other member state. They're still relying on coal. And we would like that to happen from an environmental point of view, but at the same time, from a rule of law point of view, we certainly don't want to give money to Poland because it's #1 rule of law violator to these days. So you know, as you were presenting, it came to my mind. I hadn't realized it to today, so I'm really grateful for your presentation. But do you see there that contradiction, and how do you think the two valuable and welcome objectives that the European Union is including in NGEU can be simultaneously achieved?
Diarmuid?
Thank you for another provocative question, Federico. And it's a good point. And I think, you know, one of the values of these kinds of conversations is that we have discussions across these different policy areas, and with, you know, we get to step out of our own silos, and so that I think the conference is really valuable for that. I agree with you, Federico. It's a challenge. It's certainly a tension, and I don't have any easy answers for it. You know, I wonder, are there mechanisms of providing funding to, you know, non-central government actors in Poland, you know, so regions, cities, NGOs, businesses, so you know, in a way bypassing the central government and trying to channel the funds for green transition in Poland through other mechanisms. So that's just an initial thought, but it's something that I hope we can continue to discuss in the framework of Rebuild.
Thank you, Diarmuid. And I think that's it. I think it's the idea that it's an ongoing discussion. Sorry, Petra. Sorry.
No problem. I'm conscious of the time, and I don't have any good answer because I'm not into energy policy, and I don't know how much you have to rely on central government vis-a-vis the regions in that area. I just want to make this question even more uncomfortable because you said it's more of a problem for Poland. It's very much of a problem for Hungary. We know that even if the opposition wins, they will just have a simple majority, whereas they cannot govern with the laws that are embedded into two-thirds majority laws, and that are embedded into the constitution that can only be amended by a two-thirds majority. So now the big issue for my country will be how to govern the country. It will become ungovernable because of the supermajority laws. So the question is, can you just change these two-thirds majority laws by a simple majority? Would it not be a violation of the rule of law? And how would the EU react to that? Because that would really make the situation of restoring the rule of law even more difficult for the prospective government, even if they manage to win the elections, which is it's a big if there. So I just leave these uncomfortable thoughts there, and thank you very much for the important question.
Thank you, Petra. Okay, listen, thank you, Diarmuid. Thank you, Edoardo. Thank you, Petra, for your really informative and enlightening talks. And I think they will feed into the discussions during the day. It's been my pleasure to be with you this morning and to chair this session. And I thank Federico for asking me to chair.